This is the best laptop I've ever used, hands down. But the question is, do you need it? Do you need the 911 GT3 RS? Or are you okay with the 911 Turbo? And that's kind of what this is all about. Now we're gonna compare it against the M1 Max MacBook Pro, M2 Max Mac Studio, and the M3 Max MacBook Pro. I'm gonna go over the configurations of all the machines so you have an idea what we're playing with here. For the M4 Max, I've got it spec'd out. 16-core CPU, 40-core GPU, 128 gigabytes of unified memory, 8 terabytes of internal storage with the Nano-Texture display, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. The M3 Max, 16-core CPU, 40-core GPU, 128 gigabytes of unified memory, and 8 terabytes of storage. So these are neck and neck right next to each other, except Nano-Texture display, of course. Then we got the M2 Max Mac Studio. We're going to go down in specs a little bit here. 12-core CPU, 38-core GPU, 64 gigabytes unified memory, and 2 terabytes of storage. This is going to be a spec that I think a lot of people are going to, this would be a more affordable spec for a lot of people out there, right? Now we come to the M1 Max, 10-core CPU, 32-core GPU, 64 gigabytes of unified memory, and 2 terabytes of storage. Primarily in my studio, I use the M2 Max Mac Studio for most of my work here, but ever since trying out this M4, different story altogether. So we're gonna talk about real-world usage and we're gonna talk about benchmarks because I know a lot of you guys like to see those numbers. I'm not a big benchmarks guy, but we're gonna get into it. So we're gonna be using GeekBench 6, CineBench, and then I'm gonna show you some work with DaVinci Resolve and 8K, Photoshop, Lightroom, all that great stuff. All right, here are the test numbers. Here we go. First and foremost, M1 Max MacBook Pro. 2,381 single-core score, 12,149 multi-core score, OpenCL scores 73,709, and the CineBench CPU multi-core scores 12,137, and single cores 1,528. Now the M2 Max Mac Studio is 2,854 for the single-core score, 15,466 multi-core score. OpenCL scores 89,364, and the CineBench CPU multi-core scores 14,591, and the single-core scores 1,712. Now for the M3 Max MacBook Pro, 3,093 single-core score, 21,451 multi-core score, 97,873 OpenCL score. CineBench CPU multi-core is 23,927, single cores 1,884. These numbers are massive. Last year, everybody was raving about them. Now we go to the M4 Max, the big boy. This is the 911 GT3 RS in terms of laptops. Here we go. 3,891 single core score, 25,677 multi-core score. OpenCL scores 112,259. And the CineBench CPU multi-core scores 27,399, single cores 2,181. So those are the numbers. That's what we're seeing. What does this all mean? The M4 is the fastest chipset Apple's ever made, especially in the Max configuration, especially the Pro configuration, and even the M4. Now you're probably going to see around, 15 to 20% difference for, let's say 1.3 times versus the M3. Day-to-day usage is where it's a little bit interesting because as a photographer, videographer, as you see here on this channel, I primarily use Lightroom, Photoshop. I use some DxO software as well. And I play around with Capture One, then I use, Final Cut. I use DaVinci Resolve, Audition for my audio. Those are the apps that I use primarily. And I would say that coming from the M2 Max Mac Studio, you're definitely going to see a difference between that and the M4. I would say though, is it a night and day difference? It's considerable difference. But the M1 Max MacBook Pro, you're gonna notice a difference between that and the M4, for sure, hands down. That's a 2021 laptop. This is 2024 going into 2025. So let's talk about Photoshop and Lightroom first and foremost. When it comes to the M3, M4, you're not probably gonna notice much of a difference at all, if I'm gonna be honest with you. They're both very fast, especially because I have 120 gigabytes of unified memory in both of these laptops. So there's a lot of, unified memory is a big deal. And that's something that I would recommend is always upgrade your unified memory if you can. 128 is massive, but again, if you're going to be doing multi-layers on a big programs and a lot of work, and you're having a lot of applications open, you're going to want that. And that's where that comes into play. But for those who are just using Lightroom, Photoshop, DxO kind of things like that, I think it'd be fine around 3264 thereabouts, but 128. If you have the means, go go for it. Now, when we get into Final Cut, obviously Final Cut is designed to work best with these M4 chipsets. When you get into Resolve, that's where you're gonna see a little bit of differences between the M3, M4, a little bit, but you're gonna notice between the M2 and the M4 respectively. And what I mean by that is when you get into 8K, you get into AI, face refinement, things like that, when you're using these various different applications and plugins that Resolve has, because Resolve's got a lot of stuff built inside of it. And if you're gonna be working with RED files, which I do have some samples of, a good friend of mine, Peter Choi, was very kind enough to loan me these files. I shot off the AKV Raptor from RED. You're gonna notice a little bit of stuttering when you first play back, but then after that, it plays smoothly, and that's in high quality, no proxy, no issues at all. And it's pretty much the same between the M3 and the M4 respectively, okay? So there's not a huge difference, but I think that's when you get into the layers, you're adding music, you're gonna add, any sort of effects. That's where the M4 probably will pull ahead a little bit, probably about 15-20%. It may not be that much of a difference for you. So you kind of know where I'm going with this, right? The M4, as I mentioned, is the 911 GT3 RS. It is the best laptop Apple has ever made. The M3 that just came out a year ago is absolutely fantastic. And if you bought that laptop a year ago, do you need to get an M4? And the answer is probably not, but I will say this. For those users out there, and you know who you are, who demand the best because of the workflow that you do, not because you want it, because of the workflow that you do. You're a production house, you're doing animation and 3D rendering, and you're doing a lot of very different applications that are out there, right? And that 10 to 15% is a big deal for you in terms of rendering, in terms of processing, in terms of getting those files out and that project out for your client, then it is something to consider. But you may go, well, wait a second. Do I go M4 Max with this MacBook Pro, which is portable, or do I wait for the M4 Ultra, which we know obviously is going to come based on rumors? Do we know? But it's a good guess. That's dependent on you. Get an upgraded 12 megapixel camera on this with center stage and desk viewing, so that's kind of cool if you need that. All right, guys, here's a quick test of the new 12 megapixel camera on the MacBook Pro M4 Max, and it's on center stage, so you can see me moving around here. It's going to track me this way, track me that way, and looks pretty good. I would say probably a bit better than the previous camera overall, but yeah, there you have it. But you're probably not going to go for an M3 to an M4 for that reason alone, but maybe from the M1 to the M4, yes. Outside of that though, Thunderbolt 5, great, but what products have Thunderbolt 5 right now? I'm still trying to find stuff with Thunderbolt 4 and Thunderbolt 3 for the most part. I'm using this Ivanki Fusion Hub that I've got it plugged into it right now, but Thunderbolt 5 will probably be another year or so before we see something like that. So again, it's future-proofing, which is great, but is Thunderbolt 4 good enough on the M3? Yeah. If you're looking to pick up a laptop today, right? And you're saying, well, look, there's great prices on the M3 right now. They're on discount. Should I go for an M3 if I have an M1 and just bypass the M4 and wait for next year's M5? I would say I would go for the M4. I think the M3, in my personal opinion, was a stepping stone to the M4. And I think obviously, chipsets and everything are made, they have to plan a few years in advance, and during COVID and all that stuff, fabrication, everything kind of slowed down. So I think the M3 was just a bit of a bump. It's like an M2 plus chipset, but the M4 is, I think, where Apple really wants to be at, especially with AI coming involved in all these programs and applications that are taking advantage of AI. You're going to want that processor speed. That little money that you may save on the M3 Max, MacBook Pro, I don't know, man. I would just go M4 all the way and just be done with it and not think about another laptop for the next 3 or 4 years. Because honestly speaking, Apple has really made their laptops too good. That's the problem. That's the problem with this. They have made their laptops too good. And as a result, not everybody's upgrading every year. And I think Apple recognizes that. And there's been some talk in the media that they may not do an annual, refresh of every single product because there's not really a need to do that. In terms of laptops and speeds and battery life, they're pretty much the leaders right now. I don't think anybody's coming close to this in this form factor, with this kind of power, with this kind of battery life. Unplugged, mind you, it's got that kind of power. There's no one really coming close. And with that, you've got an amazing machine. Just depends on which configuration you want and which one to go for. Let's talk about Nano-Texture display. When the M4 iPad Pro came out, I was a little bit like, oh, but I think I just want to go with standard display. It's got the rich blacks to it, everything else. When I saw the Nano-Textured on this, oh, I regret not going with Nano-Textured on the iPad Pro. It is beautiful on this display. There's no degradation and contrast whatsoever. It looks fantastic. I'm in love with the Nano-Texture display, especially if you're gonna be working in situations where I'm at with lights all over the place. You don't want any sort of glare if you're out about in a cafe or in your living room or whatever the case may be, and you don't wanna deal with that glare. This Nano-Textured is gorgeous. If you have the means and the extra funds to get it, go Nano-Textured. You won't regret it. Anyway, guys, those are my thoughts on the MacBook Pro M4 Max. Any questions you have, I'll try to answer those for you. Like always, like, subscribe, share with your friends. Thank you for the support, and I'll chat to you all very, very soon. Take care.